Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Paving a Path to Policy, Balancing Grad School and Non-Academic Work. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few webinar logistics. This webinar will run for 1 hour. All attendees on the webinar are muted except for the webinar facilitator and our presenter. If at any point during the webinar you have a question, please type it into the question box on the dashboard on your screen. Please keep your questions short and ideally to no more than 20 to 25 words. These questions will be answered to the extent that time permits during our question and answer portion of the webinar. After the webinar, I will follow up with all the webinar attendees to share today's slides and the link to SPICY's YouTube channel where a recording of today's webinar will be posted. I'm Cindy Lucas, Communications Director at the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, or SPICY for short, and I'm pleased to introduce today's moderator. Chelsea Criddle is a SPICY member who serves on the Graduate Student Committee and has been coordinating this year's webinar series. I'll now turn it over to her to begin today's webinar.
Great, thank you, Cindy. So hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to an exciting webinar as part of SPICY's Graduate Committee Policy and Applied Work webinar series. I'm Chelsea Criddle, a fifth-year PhD candidate at Tufts University, and I currently serve on SPICY's Grad Student Committee as the Policy and Applied Work Focused member at large, and I will be facilitating today's event. Today, we will be hearing from Taylor Darden, who is currently a fourth-year PhD candidate working at the National Science Foundation. But before I turn it over to our presenter, I have a few notes about SPICY and webinar procedures. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are unaware, SPICY stands for the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. Founded in 1936, SPICY is a group of over 3,000 scientists from psychology and related fields who share a common interest in research on the psychological aspects of important social and policy issues. SPICY seeks to bring theory and practice into focus on human problems of the group, the community, and nations, as well as the increasingly important problems that have no national boundaries. As an independent society, SPICY is also Division 9 of the American Psychological Association, APA, and an organizational affiliate of the American Psychological Society, APS. SPICY welcomes the membership of anyone interested in the society. Next slide, please. As an organization, SPICY offers its members a wide variety of opportunities to graduate students. So this year, we'll be having our annual conference, June 26th through June 28th in Denver, Colorado. We also have a very active grad student committee, and elections for our office positions are in the spring, so we hope you'll consider running for an open role on our committee. Committee members facilitate activities like this policy webinar, the methodology webinar series, a diversity pre-conference, writing opportunities for our graduate students, newsletters, and more. All of these opportunities aim to support grad students in their scholarly and policy-related pursuits. Next slide, please. So for more information about SPICY, you can visit our website at spicy.org and check out our YouTube channel for a recording of today's event, as well as previous webinars. So as Cindy mentioned earlier, all attendees will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar, but we know that you will likely have comments and questions, and we're definitely excited to have an interactive portion of the webinar at the end. So we ask that you pose your questions in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will organize those and ask them to our presenters. If you're interested in presenting on an upcoming webinar, please contact me at the email address on the screen. Next slide, please. So now I will present today's presenter. Taylor Darden is a rising fourth-year PhD candidate in the Community Psychology program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She earned her master's in counseling psychology from Towson University in 2016 and her bachelor's in psychology with a minor in Spanish from the University of Dayton in 2013. Taylor's research and professional interests center on how social determinants, such as racial discrimination, socioeconomic status, and gender, impact health inequities in marginalized communities, such as African Americans. She also has broader interests in social issues, such as racial injustice in the legal system, that disproportionately affect African Americans and low-income populations. She aims to address and advocate for these issues by using psychological, evidence-based research to inform policy decisions and program development, as well as evaluate those that already exist. Taylor currently works as a science analyst for the National Science Foundation. So today, Taylor will be talking about her experience balancing grad school and non-academic work. And so now I'll officially turn it over to our presenter.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today, and I'm excited to be presenting on how I got into the policy arena and how I balance graduate school and non-academic work. So just an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First, I'm going to go over my professional background and research interest. Then I'll be going over my academic program, specifically the course plan and academic requirements. I'll then move into my path into non-academic work and how I started in that field. I'll then talk about my different internship experiences working outside of academia. And while I'm talking about these experiences, I'm going to be framing them in the context of my academic progress while I was completing these experiences, as well as the academic milestones that I was striving for while in these internship experiences. Lastly, I'll end with some tips for balancing graduate school and non-academic work. So just a little bit about my background. In 2014, I received my bachelor's in psychology. At the time, my research interests were in marriage and family therapy and forensic psychology. I then got my master's in counseling psychology in 2016. And at that time, my research interest had expanded to the criminal justice system. And that's when I started to gain my interest in non-academic work, specifically policy. So I was involved on a research team that looked at race-based confirmation bias and errors in eyewitness testimony. And the professor that I was working with first introduced me to the idea that research can be used to influence and inform policy because he had been involved on a series of white papers that he and other colleagues compiled to present to local legislators to influence policy in the criminal justice system. So in 2016, I began my PhD program. I'm expected to graduate next year. I'm currently in the community psychology program, but I started off in a slightly different program, which I will discuss a little bit more later. All my prior internships before were very therapy focused. And so I worked at a place called Affiliated Sante Group, and this was a mobile crisis unit in which I was dispatched by the local police to go out to situations that required therapists. Also did individual and marriage and family therapy at Lighthouse Youth Services Bureau. And then during my PhD program, I worked at the UMBC Psychology Training Clinic, where I did one-on-one therapy and couples therapy. So a little bit about why I wanted to get a PhD. So when I was ending my master's program, I started to entertain the idea of getting a PhD, number one, because I knew it would give me access to versatile career options. So with that, my master's, I would have just got licensed as a therapist. I would have sort of been limited to just doing therapy. But with the PhD, I can branch out and maybe get into academia, of course, as a professor, or other research-related careers. Relatedly, I wanted to gain more research skills and experience. Both my degrees, my master's and my bachelor's, I didn't do much research experience, especially my master's. There was a practitioner track and a research track, and I chose the former. So most of my coursework was geared towards therapy and not research. I also had an interest in starting to get more into non-academic work, and so I needed to branch out from my therapy background. And lastly, I wanted to earn a PhD because there was increased sort of earning potential for me. So a little bit about my academic program. I'm in the Human Services Psychology PhD program. So there's 3 different tracks: the clinical track, community track, and a biology track. And I was previously in the clinical/community track when I first started the program. So just to pause for a second to give you guys a little bit of background about what community psychology is. So it essentially goes beyond the individual focus, say that like regular therapy does in psychology. by integrating social, cultural, economic, political, etc. influences in the promotion of positive change in health and empowerment, and not only individual levels, but systemic levels as well. Community psychologists can work in a variety of different roles. They can be educators, professors, program directors, consultants, and a host of other roles. In these roles, they can also work in a variety of different arenas. So community organizations, universities, government agencies, schools, etc. So the academic course plan for the clinical community dual track is as follows. The first year, you have to do classes, which is usually 4, and do either a research assistantship or teaching assistantship. The second year, in addition to classes and your RA or TA, you have to go to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County Psychology Clinic, and that's about 16 hours a week minimum. In addition to that, we're also expected to begin writing our thesis and preparing for qualifying exams, which are taken after your second year, the summer before you begin your third. The third year of the program, in addition to classes and RA, we leave the UMBC clinic and do an externship, which is a minimum of 20 hours per week. We're also beginning to write our dissertations. The fourth year of the program, in addition to the things done in the third year, we begin applying to APA internship, which is a very time-intensive process. It's sort of similar to applying to PhD programs in that you have to almost put in 20 to 30 hours a week getting your application ready and all your materials. So it's a pretty time-intensive process. And lastly, the fifth year of this program would be leaving the state or city and going to do your APA internship. So with all these academic requirements for my program, there were a lot of challenges, as you can guess, mainly just trying to balance everything. So classes, your RA/TA, the clinic hours, and also writing a thesis, a dissertation, it can be a lot. So time management is a big piece of that, wanting to do everything. And for me, I was in the dual track, so my program was set up for me to have clinic and externship pretty much as a requirement, but there were no real community psychology requirements outside of a few classes. So I had an issue kind of balancing it all. Another challenge that came with this course plan, advisor approval. So sometimes your advisor may not approve of going into non-academic work because it may interfere with classes, lab work, or other academic requirements, especially since that non-academic work does not always parallel with your course plan. And more generally, programs in general often don't promote non-academic work because they promote academia, specifically research and teaching. So the opportunities for non-academic work may be scarce, or one may not feel supported in wanting to do non-academic work. So that can be another potential challenge with a course plan like this. Often you feel like you're picking and choosing between the two, which I personally did, between clinical and community, which is why I eventually ended up dropping the clinical track of my program and becoming strictly community after my second year, so I can focus more on non-academic work. Obviously, every program isn't the same, and every program is different, but it can still be hard to balance all these things, even if you don't have to do clinical hours or externship hours. It's pretty just hard in general to go into non-academic work when you're in an academic environment. Sometimes you're lucky enough for the two worlds to overlap, but that isn't always the case. So I want to get a little bit into how I got into non-academic work, specifically policy. So the very first thing that I did that I feel like set my path into play was joining professional organizations. So I joined APA. Well, I was already in APA in undergrad, but when I got to grad school, that's when I learned about divisions within APA. And immediately from my peers, I was told to join SPICY and SCRAW. And so that's what I did. I also joined ABSI, the National Prevention Science Coalition, and the American Evaluation Association. I benefited a lot from each of these organizations directly and indirectly, which I'll discuss a little bit later. But essentially, I feel like joining these organizations led to me getting key internships in the field, specifically non-academic internships, and ultimately led to me gaining my first job. So, obviously this is not an exhaustive list of organizations to join. These are the ones that I joined just based on my interests and based off suggestions of my peers. But if you aren't sure where to start, I think it's important to join the main or the top organization in your field, which I was already a part of, APA, and see if they have any divisions that interest you. For me, that was SPICY and SCRAW. So one big question about joining professional organizations might be why, like what value do they have? So for me, joining was beneficial because they provided me access to many things, one being listservs. Listservs can be beneficial in many ways, but what you can see, some of them include announcements about internships, fellowships, awards, news and information in the field, like maybe new cutting edge research. You can also get invited to workshops and webinars on listservs. So my first non-academic internship, I actually heard about through a listserv. So it's just an example of how you can get into that work just by joining it in an organization. Another benefit of joining an organization is being on committees. It's a chance to get to know people, but it's also a chance to get more hands-on involvement in the field, specifically if you want to do non-academic work, and you can produce actual products, which is helpful if you want to gain skills and experience, but you can also put them on your CV and have something to talk about when you're applying for an internship or fellowship. So for example, I joined the public policy committee for SCRAW, and I got many opportunities such as reviewing mini grants, creating, contributing to a local advocacy toolkit, and reviewing rapid responses. So things such as that. And committees can also be beneficial because they can provide you with leadership roles in the organization. Another benefit of joining organizations are the connections you make, which can happen in many ways, like listservs and committees, but just meeting people in the field whose research interests you, informational interviews, collaborations, etc. You can learn a lot. So I actually found out about APA's Workshop and Advocacy Day through a workshop that I went through a connection I made, and that eventually led to me getting an internship at APA, which I'll talk a little bit about more, but that's an example of how the different benefits of being in an organization can build on each other and connect to one another. Conferences are also very beneficial. It's a great way to present your research and learn more about the work going on in the field. It obviously overlaps with connections, listserv, and collaboration. For example, I got to do a symposium at the SPICY conference in 2018, and I was able to collaborate with a researcher in the field by a posting on a listserv. I also got to meet several individuals that held leadership roles and fellowships at that conference, and so that was a great chance to connect with them and learn more about their roles, engage if it was a good fit for me by talking to them about what they were doing. Conferences are also great because you kind of have like an automatic revolving door of opportunities. So for example, a person that I've met at a conference before, she was leaving her job and she knew I was looking for a job at the time. So when she was leaving her position, she referred her position to me through her boss. Just little things like that are beneficial. And also pre-conference workshops are very beneficial, and you can get hands-on non-academic experience. For example, I went to an evaluation conference and I learned how to use logic models and evaluation tools in an applied setting through that workshop. Lastly, organizations are beneficial to join because it's a chance to publish and disseminate your work. So for example, I published this blog in SPICY's Sound Science, Sound Policy blog, and this gave me a chance to write about something I was very interested in. Also, it gave me practice in an actual product in non-academic writing, which I would say is very important. So every non-academic internship that I've had, they always ask to see writing samples, non-academic writing samples. And so if you're in an environment in your graduate program where you don't get a chance to have non-academic products, that could be a challenge. So it's definitely important to try to have non-academic works. Overall, these benefits of joining organizations kind of overlap with one another, but can definitely be beneficial in securing future opportunities. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my non-academic internship experiences in the context of my academic progress and how I was balancing them. So my first non-academic internship was with the National Prevention Science Coalition, and I learned about this job and this organization as a whole through being on a listserv. So the National Prevention Science Coalition is a group of scientists, educators, etc. They do nonpartisan work with congressional offices aimed at incorporating evidence-based knowledge on various social issues into legislation. They also do similar work with federal agencies aimed at incorporating prevention science into their work. So I was on the research to policy collaboration team within the National Prevention Science Coalition. Their goal is to develop a strategy for developing productive relationships between prevention researchers, practitioners, and federal offices, with the goal of collaborating to use evidence-based prevention and practices into public policies. This was essentially a model for bridging research to policy, and this model has been applied to other organizations outside of the National Prevention Science Coalition. It recognizes that direct contact between researchers and policymakers are really necessary to support evidence-based policy. So that's one way to kind of link your academic world and your non-academic world is through research. That's a big overlapping area. So as a research to policy collaboration intern, I first wanted to do this because this was my first I was maybe 2 or 3 months into my PhD program, and I had just joined the organization in listservs, and I had an interest in non-academic work. My program was very structured around my clinical work, and so I thought it was necessary to get this experience. And people in my program above me, they stressed the importance of trying to get experiences that if you wanted non-academic experiences to do it your first year, because that's the year, it's pretty much the only year in the program which you are not doing clinical work, and so you have a freer schedule. So I decided to do this because I wanted to get that experience. So a list of on the side you see my academic progress and activities. So I was the intern with the Research to Policy Collaboration for 3 years. My first year, like I said, was the easiest to fit into my schedule because I did not have any requirements besides my coursework and my research assistantship. Once I got to my second year, and third year, it was much harder because I had clinic. So that was 20 hours a week, balancing that. And I also had 12-hour days, and I was doing a thesis. So it got pretty hard to balance my academic and non-academic world once I entered my second and third year. I was also doing a project at school. It's called the Student Voice Project, which was it was like a research project, but it had non-academic trajectory. So essentially we were doing focus groups in Baltimore with high school students to gauge their thoughts and about police officers in the Baltimore City schools carrying weapons. And so once we finished collecting that research, we disseminated it through community organizations with the goal of informing or influencing legislation. So one thing that helped me kind of balance myself when I started doing all this was this online tool called Kanban Flow. So here's an example of, so what you get to do is you have a board. So my board was called School. I also had a personal board, an internship board, but within your boards, you can have different lanes. So I have one lane called my TA, which was for a class called Psych 342. And then at the very bottom, you can see one of my classes, survey methodology. And so I like this a little bit more than other methods, maybe like Google Calendar, because I could actually put every single thing that I had to do. So within my lane, you have a to-do list, which has everything I have to do, and it has due dates. Then you have a due today. So if you want to move something over that you have to do today, you can move it over there. And then you have an in progress list, and then you have a done. And so you see I also use color coding. So yellow meant it wasn't very high priority because it was due later. Orange meant it was going to be due pretty soon, and red meant like do it now. And so whenever you have deadlines coming up, they'll email you and say, Kanban Flow would email you and say, no, you have this due in a week, or you have this due today, or this needs to be moved to the in progress category by next week so it can be done in 2 weeks. So that was very much a very structured way for me to organize everything that I was doing at once. And so here's some, just a little overview of some of the things that I did when I was an intern and some of the skills that I gained. So mainly I was a bridge between researchers and legislators. So if legislative staff or congresswoman or man basically wanted to get more information about, for example, human trafficking, there's a bill on human trafficking coming up and they wanted more information on the subject so they can make a decision, they would contact us, and then we would call that a legislative request. And once we had a legislative request, we would go to our database of researchers to see which researchers were very skilled or knowledgeable in that area. So then we would then connect the two. My next non-academic research, my next non-academic internship was with a company called, or organization called Results. I got this internship, and this was one of my internships that happened to be a part of class. So I was lucky for that. I took a public policy course my first year of graduate school, and my professor essentially said that we could replace one of our class requirements with an advocacy option. So I chose the advocacy option. I have to do 2 to 3 hours a week at an organization of my choice. So I chose Results because that was one of the guest presenters we had come to class. So it's a nonprofit organization that essentially pushes for policies and legislation to address poverty. There's a team of volunteers, and they receive training and support to become skilled advocates. And the goal is for them to learn to effectively advise policymakers to improve different issues that relate to poverty, so education, health, and economic opportunity. So within this organization, I was an advocacy intern. While doing this, I was still in my first year. I was taking coursework, I was a research assistantship, I was doing internship work with the National Prevention Science Coalition, and I was still working on the Student Voice Project. So this internship fit into my schedule a little better than the National Prevention Science Coalition because, one, it was only 2 to 3 hours per week. It was still my first year, but mainly it was a part of a class requirement. And so that's a big tip, is to try to get academic experience, non-academic experiences that overlap with your class requirements. And here are some of the skills that I gained and duties that I did in this internship. So conducting literature reviews, help making fact sheets and op-eds with the goal of presenting them to congressmen or their staffers. So for example, we had a SNAP EBT social justice issue that came up. So we did some research, made a fact sheet, and then we had a meeting with Rep. J.B. Raskin in Maryland, and we presented the research to him to try to get him to support a certain bill. So my next non-academic internship was with APA. I got into this internship, it was kind of through connections, but also through a workshop at the same time, which kind of stresses the importance of making connections when you want to to have non-academic experiences. So after my first year of my PhD program, I learned about a workshop that was being held at APA. It was a policy workshop and advocacy day. And when I ended this workshop and policy day, I essentially approached APA staffers and told them that it was very informative and that I was interested in the work and that I was interested in an internship. So they told me to reach back out closer to summer. So I reached back out to them in March of 2018, and this was right before I switched tracks to being completely community, and I was able to gain an internship. So that's just an example of how listservs, workshops, and making connections and things of that nature can help you get non-academic experiences. So APA is obviously the largest professional organization for psychology. Their mission is to promote the advancement and application of psychological science and knowledge to benefit society and improve lives, and promote research in psychology and application of research findings. So I was in the public interest directorate, and kind of the similar is the overall mission of APA. They apply science in the practice of psychology, and they promote equitable and just treatment through education, training, and public policy. They also encourage the advancement of equal opportunity and foster empowerment. So within the public interest directorate, there were several offices, and I was in the public interest government relations office. This office applied psychology essentially to the promotion of the same thing, equitable and just treatment. But they had a very specific focus. Government relations was to communicate with legislators. So they often did work on the Hill. So a few of their activities included congressional briefings and testimonies, educating psychologists on how to advocate for psychology on local levels, national levels, and educating politicians on the contributions of psychology to public policy. So for example, there was a legislation bill up for on the Hill that was coming up. It related to the shackling of pregnant women in prison. So that was a portfolio for the Public Interest Government Relations Office, and they would take research that they gathered and go to the Hill to kind of talk to the legislators about how the psychology can be applied to this policy and the effects of that. The policy areas that this office looks at is civil rights, criminal justice, gun violence, and things of that nature. So when I was an intern in this office, it was right before my third year began. It was the summer after my second year. I had just switched tracks, so I was no longer in the dual program, clinical and community. I was simply just community. I had a teaching assistantship. I was finishing my thesis, and I was on a committee, the SCRAW Public Policy Committee. And I also had several journal articles that were in the works and conference presentations to prepare for. So my academic workload was kind of busy and large, but it was also the summer and I had just switched tracks, which was important for me because this allowed me to do non-academic work without sacrificing my clinical hours. So this was actually counted as a practicum. And as a community student, we were required to do 2 practicums for 6 credit hours. And because I was now a fully community, this counted. So this is an example of how you can balance the 2 by having the 2 overlap. I got to fulfill the academic requirement and get a non-academic internship at the same time. Here are some examples of some of the work that I did in this position, mainly conducting literature reviews on certain topics and summarizing the findings for a non-scientific audience, specifically congressional staffers and congressmen. As I mentioned before, non-scientific writing was very important to them. They wanted to see writing samples that I did non-academically. So when I applied to this internship, I had a few non-academic writing samples from my work with results. I had a policy brief, I had an op-ed, and then from my work with the National Prevention Science Coalition. Also, so I developed these writings for APA, essentially expressing their support of certain bills, and it will be used either to directly advocate on the Hill with the legislator or to just express their support, APA support, through a publication. My next non-academic internship was with the American Evaluation Association. Evaluation involves assessing strengths and weaknesses of a program or policy to improve their effectiveness. This association is a professional association of evaluators that essentially apply and explore program evaluation. And their mission is to improve evaluation practices and methods. So one thing that I learned when I joined this organization and got this internship was that a lot of the research skills that I had in academia transferred heavily over to evaluation and program evaluation. Essentially, it's the same thing, but you're applying your research skills in a different setting for a different reason. And I learned about this internship through a professor that was a community psychologist. So the internship I had was called JEDI, Graduate Education Diversity Internship. And it was aimed at expanding the pool of graduate students of color or other underrepresented groups in the field who wanted to extend their research capacities to evaluation. Another goal was to engage and support these students and stimulate evaluation thinking, specifically culturally responsive evaluation. And lastly, deepen the evaluation capacity to work in racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse settings. So a little bit about the structural components of this internship. So the internship component was essentially me working 2 days a week at a host site, which happened to be the National Science Foundation. So this was my first legitimate kind of introduction to non-academic world because I was actually in a work environment. So 2 days a week, and we received a stipend in exchange. It was for 9 months. There's also a training and networking component, which included several seminars, conferences, and an evaluation project. Lastly, the support mechanism, which included my academic advisor, the advisor or supervisor at my host site, which is the National Science Foundation, and support from AEA staff and our online community of former JEDI. So while I was doing this non-academic internship, I was in my 3rd year and I was finishing up classes, doing a TA. I defended my thesis and I was preparing for qualifying exams. And I also started writing my dissertation. So I was pretty busy, but it was easier to balance this non-academic internship as opposed to my first one, which is the National Prevention Science Coalition, because this overlapped with my academic requirements. So again, as a community-only student, I had a practicum requirement. So I was able to, in addition to my APA internship, I got to use this JEDI internship as an academic requirement. So that was one way these two worlds overlapped. Another way how these overlapped is through my classes. So I had a program evaluation class, which was very much like aligning with my internship because it was a big component of my internship was to do evaluation. So I was able to take things that I learned from my internship and apply it to class and vice versa. Also took a survey methodology course. One of the requirements for that course was to develop a survey. And it just so happened that within my internship, there was an evaluation need for a program. So I was able to develop a survey for the internship that counted as my class survey. So this is another example of how it's easier to balance academic work and non-academic work when they overlap. I didn't have to create a separate survey for class and a separate survey to do an evaluation at my internship. I was able to create one that served two purposes. That was very helpful. And here is some of the duties that I did and some of the skills that I gained through my internship evaluation, basically, essentially evaluative survey development and text and document analysis, report writing, etc. Also got to make this overlap with my academic milestones because the methodology that I used in evaluating programs within my internship at NSF ended up being the same methodology that I'm using in my dissertation, which was text and document analysis. So I was learning a new software, which is called Envivo, and doing a new methodology, text and document analysis. And I actually ended up doing that for my dissertation. My last non-academic internship, well, it's not an internship, it's actually a job. I got hired at the National Science Foundation as a science analyst. So I'm in the Directorate for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences, which basically supports research, people in society, and focuses on human behavior, social organizations, and how different forces affect people. I'm also within the Directorate for SBE, I'm in the division of SES, and it seeks to enhance the understanding of individual, social, and organizational behavior by creating and sustaining social sciences, and so basically supporting disciplinary and interdisciplinary research that advances knowledge. So as a science analyst, currently my academic activities are, the list may be shorter than the other ones, but the biggest thing is my dissertation, which we all know takes up a lot of time. So although I'm done with classes, I still have my dissertation to do. So balancing work and balancing academic, my non-academic job is a little different than my internships, obviously, because instead of doing 10 or 20, even 5 hours a week, I'm doing 40 hours a week so it's a little different, and a couple ways how I balance it, which I'll get into and discuss later. I'm honestly still figuring out personally, but my job has flexibility that allows me to balance these two worlds. So I'm able to telework twice a week. That's really helpful. I save 6 hours a week alone in my commute just from being able to work at home twice a week. So that's very helpful. Also helps to have writing blocks. Because I work 8 hours a day, my only time to write is nights and weekends. So it really helps to say, okay, I'm going to write from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. and I have an actual chunk of time in which I'm going to write and stick to it. Another part of that is accountability. So whether it be fellow peers or people you also know who are writing their dissertation, or even joining a writing group, which I plan to do soon. That's other ways to be accountable. And here are some tasks that I'm currently doing in this non-academic experience. So conducting analyses, developing reports, and compiling and presenting that information for program information and outcomes. So these are some of the pros and cons to me of balancing grad school and non-academic work. Obviously, when you're in non-academic fields, you're getting job experiences in the field you're interested in, which helps advance your career. You also get to network with working professionals in your field, which is very beneficial. And obviously, you get an increased salary. And particularly for my job, and not for all jobs, but you have access to funding for professional development. That can include workshops, webinars, conferences, etc. So you have more opportunities to further increase skills that you want to have so you can gain more non-academic experiences. Some of the cons for me in balancing these two worlds, definitely your graduate program milestones become second priority, specifically more so when you're full-time, but not necessarily part-time. And there's increased risks for stress, fatigue, burnout, and prolonged time to finish program milestones. I have to come to work every day. I can't avoid that. So obviously my dissertation has become a back burner, if you will, and I have to find time to write in addition to working. So that's the biggest con for me. Just a review of some helpful tips that I think are useful when trying to balance these two worlds. So definitely time management, trying to make a schedule and stick to it. Find an organization tool that works for you. For me, it was the online Kanban flow, but you can use Google Calendars. Some people like writing in planners, whatever works for you to have like strict times and a schedule to stick to. And again, a strict writing schedule. Get an accountability partner. It could be a peer that's also working on a PhD, a friend, or a writing group. But it's easy to fall behind if you don't have a strict writing schedule. Try to explore jobs that have opportunity for flexibility. So like I said, I'm able to telework twice a week. Some jobs also have alternative work schedule. My job offers this as well, which basically means that you, for 4 days a week, you work 10 hours a day, and then the 5th day you get off because you did your 40 hours in the 4 days. Another option is flex schedule, which my job also offers. This means there's a wider window of when you can come to work as opposed to traditional 9 to 5. So I can come to work as early as 6 a.m., leave at 2, or I can come to work as late as 11 a.m. and leave at 7. So for some people, this window can help. So I can get to work at 6:30 in the morning and leave at 2:30 and still essentially have a full day to write and have a writing chunk from 4 to 8. So having the flexibility to come to work that early is really helpful. Another trick or tip to balancing these two worlds is definitely supportive mentorship at school and at your non-academic work experience. So I have an academic advisor who's very supportive, and I also have a supervisor at work who's very supportive. And so that can be kind of reassuring and motivation to further help you do what you need to do to finish your academic requirements, but also not sacrificing your job requirements. And like I said before, try to make these two worlds overlap whenever you can. For me, that was being very familiar with my handbook, because my handbook and the requirements for my program allowed me to know, okay, so I need 2 practicum internships, and these are the settings which I can get them in. If I'm more aware of those rules, then that helps me when I go out and seek a non-academic internship. I can purposely and intentionally seek a non-academic internship that I know will meet my academic requirements. The same with classes. If I'm interested in a certain class, survey methodology, like I took those classes were requirements, but they also overlapped with what I was doing in that semester with my NSF internship. So that was very helpful for me. And lastly, everyone tells me this, a good dissertation is a done dissertation. And this can apply to other academic requirements as well. Essentially means you don't have to always strive for perfectionism in your academic requirements. Just putting in the work and getting them done is very good enough and helps you balance these two worlds by not stressing, by trying to perfect something. So that's it. I'll take some questions now after a few announcements from our webinar facilitator, Chelsea.
Okay, so we're actually going to do the questions first. And so we have a couple of questions now, but if you still have some questions on your mind, feel free to type them in now. And so for our first question, you talked a lot about balancing academic work and non-academic work, Taylor, but do you have any advice on balancing work in your actual life? So do you have time for a personal life throughout your graduate career? And what has been your experience navigating that?
Yes, that's a great question. I find a lot of the tips that can apply to balancing work and non-academic work can also be applied to work and personal life. So for example, the same way you can set a schedule to write, you can also be intentional in saying, okay, if I'm working this many hours a week and I have this many classes, I'm going to find time for myself. So maybe Friday nights, you're not going to do any work from school or work, and you're just going to do personal self-care, whether that be TV or hang out with a friend. Kind of setting time to put yourself first will help keep you sane and balance those two worlds.
Yeah,
Also,
definitely.
like I mentioned, having an internship or job that's flexible really helps me not only balance my dissertation, but my personal life.
Gotcha. So you touched on this a bit in the last slide, but I'll just ask it again. So were there any other avenues of support that helped you throughout this process? So you mentioned your advisor and someone that you worked with, but were there other, like maybe more senior graduate students or other mentors in the field, or even a career center on campus that helped you throughout this process, or that might help others?
Yeah, I haven't personally used my career center just because I'm honestly very far from my campus, but peers, specifically senior graduate students, are very helpful because they've gone through what you've gone through and they're currently going through what you're going through. And that applies to people you network with in the field. By being in all these non-academic internships, I met a lot of PhD PhD holders. And so when I'm talking to them about my experiences, it's very validating, motivational, also helps keep me grounded to talk to them about what they did to navigate this, or even just some motivation to keep going.
Gotcha. So two people have asked about just whether you can restate the program that you use to manage your daily schedule.
Yeah, it's called Kanban flow. So it's spelled Kanban.
Gotcha. Thank you. Um, So this is a really good question, and I know that you and I have both talked about this offline. So are all of these internships you talked about paid? I'm currently a graduate student, but still trying to work outside of my program. So how have you, or what has been your experience navigating the paid versus unpaid internships and kind of the benefits or the cons of that?
Yeah, so only one of my internships was actually paid, which was through the American Evaluation Association. The JEDI internship gives you a stipend of $10,000. And, obviously my full-time job at NSF is paid. But my internship at the National Prevention Science Coalition, results, and at APA were all unpaid. And honestly, that was very hard to balance, but it was just a sacrifice that I made because I knew I needed those experiences to advance my career and get in the door. So, different things that I did to kind of offset. When you do an RATA at my school, you get a small stipend. It's not huge, but it helps you float. And I also did things on the side like Uber and Lyft when I could here and there. And I did take out loans occasionally to help me offset my costs. But I will say, I did all this unpaid work and now I'm making a pretty decent salary. So if you can try to put up with the unpaid work, it will definitely pay off in the end because you're getting those experiences and skills you need.
Gotcha. And so we have about 5 minutes left, so we're going to wrap up the questions. So if you can go to the next slide, Taylor. Okay, so if again, if you didn't get a chance to ask a question and you really want to, feel free again to contact me at chelsea.criddle@tufts.edu, and I'll be happy to field those questions and get them over to our presenter. And again, you all will be receiving a copy of the slides later on for all who registered for the webinar, and they will also be up, the recording will be up on our YouTube website. And so before we conclude, I want to end with a few announcements and reminders. Applications are now open for the James Marshall Fellowship, which will allow you to spend a year working on Capitol Hill, and applications are due February 1st, 2020. Additionally, applications and nominees are now available for the Outstanding Teaching and Mentoring Award, which is due February 15th, 2020, and the SPICY Innovative Teaching Award, which is due March 1st, 2020. And if you want more information on any of those opportunities, you can visit our website. Next slide, please. And so lastly, SPICY's Damas Taylor Summer Minority Policy Fellowship is a really great opportunity to gain non-academic policy experience. I myself took part in this policy fellowship in 2018. And so applications are due for this fellowship on March 1st, 2020. So again, please visit our website at spissy.org for more information. And so I want to thank you very much, Taylor, for an amazing presentation. I think it was very informative, and I hope that our attendees got a lot out of it. Please stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be announced later on through our Spissy listserv. And if Cindy doesn't have anything left to add, I think that concludes today's webinar.